back, Hu Jintao's China and the ambitions that the CCP had vis-a-vis Chinese society versus Xi Jinping's China and the relationship that the CCP is constructing with Chinese society today. How do NGOs fit in that kind of arc of change?
I mean, a lot less space for them, right? Explicitly. I mean, because a lot of the growth of NGOs that I talk about in my earlier work was within the context of the small state, big society formulation under Hu Jintao. And this is something, incidentally, whenever I talk about the small state, big society formulation, where essentially the government shrinks and society steps up to take over the responsibilities. I mean, we had this in the UK, right? Mm-hmm. Under the coalition government with David Cameron, he had a program called Big Society. I mean, coincided at the same time as Hu Jintao's small state, big society. They had the same thing in mind of enlisting the help of NGOs to do that work. And obviously we know that there's been a huge shift, not just away from this small state formulation under Hu Jintao, but towards greater re-centralization under Xi Jinping, and just more suspect of social actors. At the same time, it hasn't been greeted with a huge shrinking of the size of the NGO sector. I mean, certainly it has shrunk. Now, unfortunately, the data that we use in our research, most recent research, stops in 2018. So we can only talk about the change up until then. The space has shrunk. It's a lot less diverse. And the way that the state uses registration law has definitely changed and become, depending upon where the NGO is and the work that it's doing, has become more restrictive. But the name of the game really is, in part, greater restrictions, but on the flip side, actually, if you look at the charity law, it actually looks a little bit more permissive. And the argument that I've made in previous work is essentially, this is because the state has come to trust that most of these NGOs are actually going to behave. So the tether exists, but the tether is more slack. It's very striking if you look at essentially the laws about domestic NGOs in China versus the law in international NGOs. The law in international NGOs is far more restrictive, right? Mm-hmm. And I attribute that in large part to the belief that they can't trust international NGOs like they can trust domestic NGOs. Mm-hmm. I mean, short answer now, preceding my long answer to your question, is essentially, it seems as though NGOs have now existed in this context long enough to know the way that they should behave. The way that they should behave to exist, right? And that, going back to the very first question you asked, has continued to change what it is to be an NGO. And this is not limited to the Chinese context. We can talk about NGOs that are behaving in this more apolitical, careful way, even in democratic contexts.